of people in the
Okay.
room.
The last times I was there, it was showing
Oh,
this. It was showing
yeah.
you guys. So
And
didn't.
now it's populating with people joining us in the Zoomagog, as it were. Mm.
No, that's great because last time I was there, the screen was showing the room, which didn't make much sense to me.
But again, when I'm looking at the picture of the room, it looks like you and I, Tomas, are kind of highlighted. But oh, you know what, Caroline, if you would remove the oh, I'm sorry, my bad.
Yeah, what the owl gives us is a strange panorama of everyone, and then it supposedly zooms in on the speaker. Um,
Yeah. The
Yeah,
question is,
also we need to keep it on speaker view for the hour for the live stream and stuff. So
oh, right. I guess that's the problem.
but I am seeing your beautiful face in half the screen, and then the beautiful faces of our Zoom cohort cascading down the right-hand side.
Yeah,
Perhaps,
it says
perhaps
you
sliding
guys,
the bar,
you guys are
perhaps
on.
sliding the bar would give room for more of the little faces.
Yeah, it sounds like you're on speaker view
How come I'm not in the front?
in the room.
You will be. You will
Oh,
be.
I'm speaking.
You're going to be elevated like Joshua.
Well, there we go.
There is a little slide bar that can be used to make one screen a little smaller so that the other screen gets, so that the view of the faces gets bigger.
So wearing my Columbia professor hat, I'm going to say that it's 8:45 and we're going to begin. Wearing the Montessori school hat of my cousin Leslie to start the ritual of study. She says to just change the energy in the room. She says to everyone, clap once. My Hebrew being very bad, I would invite someone whose Hebrew is even only slightly good to lead us in the blessing for Torah study. And then what will happen is I'll give a little idiosyncratic overview of the Parsha itself from here in the room. Then we're going to hand it over to Asher Chaim, who's going to lead us more closely through the text itself. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this Parsha significantly is about Joshua and the Joshua generation and how people muddle through without their accustomed leaders and teachers and prophets. And so we are all Joshuas today. Rabbi Diane had personal event that precluded her attendance, and it's the privilege of Asher Chaim and I to try and invite you to be a self-organized, communitarian, radical, student-led study group this morning. So we're grateful to you for all being leaders in that sense, and for all being Joshuas. So in that spirit, who feels like they'd like to say a blessing in beautiful Hebrew?
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotsav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. So none of us are experts, especially today. But
Is there such thing as an expert?
there's an ex-expert, I think. People who have learned that they know less than they thought. I think I qualify as one of them. And my expertise will be revealed as I just summarize the Parsha for us a little bit before we tune in on the more detailed theme around the idea of secession, which is, of course, very topical, and closer readings of the text that Asher Chaim is going to lead us in. I'll share with you something very personal because the personal is universal, especially in this room. And then I'll touch on a few things in the Parsha. In life in general, I find, but especially at Romemu, there are coincidences that are not coincidences, that are in fact convergences and minor revelations and happenstances that remind us that the instruction is not to pray for miracles, but just to pray to recognize the miracles. So a minor miracle is Pinchas, the parsha of today. It is my favorite of them all. It is my favorite of them all. I never had a bar mitzvah, so it's not my Torah portion. Maybe I'll do it in the future. And it's my favorite of them all, not because I understand it the best, alas, not because it has taught me the most, because I'm just learning it here with you again and again and again, but because it was the first Torah portion that I ever studied formally in Havruta partnership and being taught the nature of Torah study in a kind of yeshiva tradition. And I did it formally with a partner in Central Park. We did it outdoors. We were lying on the pine needles near the Shakespeare Theater. It was a very beautiful and distracting day, and we just lay under a tree early on Saturday morning. And I wish I could tell you our study was incredibly insightful. But what I learned from this was not necessarily the content of the Parsha, but simply the ritual itself of study and the act of working with the Havruta and the act of speaking and listening and continuing that unbroken chain on a golden morning on the pine needles. And so I always have a special love for Pinchas for that reason, and I associate the name Pinchas with the pine needles, right? Pine, I don't know. And the sunlight coming through the trees and the sound of the Shakespearean actors rehearsing. So I love this parsha more than any other. And so just by beautiful coincidence, it is doubly my privilege to attempt to speak on it today. And I can give you a little bit my first impressions. I remember them from that beautiful morning years ago, which were basically, what the fuck, right? To be profane, because it's not especially beautiful, right? It's not especially coherent, and the lessons are ambiguous, and there are very trivial events, and there are events which are very important in retrospect, especially this kind of investiture of Joshua, which Asher Chaim is going to direct our attention to more. And for someone not coming from an experience of Torah study, and especially not coming from familiarity with the 5 books of Moses, it's alarming. And first of all, there's Pinchas, who, like, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Like in Western tradition, if we allow ourselves to peek up at the previous paragraph, he spears the lovers, right, in the belly. Romeo and Juliet get killed by this dude, right? And in the Western tradition of literature, certainly, he would be a villain. And the kind of forbidden lovers in the tent would be the hero and the heroine. And that right away is sobering and a reminder that we are dealing with the Bronze Age. But we're also dealing with a radical present age, and we're dealing with rigor and gevurah and discipline and justice, and not necessarily the kind that I was accustomed to when I learned this text. I think people need to mute on the Zoom. And so that was shocking to me. I was like, oh, this guy stabs the lovers and is somehow rewarded. And for someone more accustomed casually to a sort of peace and love divine, I'm like, oh, okay. This is not your father's Bible. In my case, quite literally. I was more acquainted with the 4 Gospels. Then there's this call to war. And again, like, war? Aren't we supposed to turn our swords into plowshares? So I was shocked again. Then we have these other strange litanies mixed in. We have this vast census, this amazing succession of names, which are beautiful, but so other. And I love these biblical names because you have like these super exotic, mysterious, gorgeous, clans of Ard and Imnah and Ishvi and Asher and Zelophehad, right? And Manasseh and Ephraim. And these are the names of either like beautiful hillbillies, right? Or people from another world. And then every now and then you have Joshua, right? You know, it's like, oh yeah, Josh, we know him. So this amazing combination of intimacy and alterity, the self and the other. So just endless names, right? And then at the end we have punctilious, pedantic, amazingly boring instructions about which sacrifice for every single festival, and the ram and the bull, and this without blemish, and this, that, and the other, and this like meticulous set of instructions for how to run every ritual, which is not necessarily what we think of, or certainly what I thought of as literature. And then blended in, we have other things that show up, which are seemingly trivial events, but that end up potentially having great importance, like the elevation of Pinhas and his heirs to this hereditary status, and the investiture of Joseph, more significantly, and potentially his heirs and followers to a significant status. And again, as someone coming to this, that's disorienting. The idea of hereditary inheritance, either of property or of status, because for someone like me coming from something like Catholicism that aspires, or Islam, the other Abrahamic heirs, that call themselves universal religions, one of the few great things about Catholicism, for example, is anyone can be a priest. You just have to hear the call. And the idea of heredity for someone new to it is troubling, especially if you're accustomed to a so-called universal religion like Islam or Catholicism and Christianity. And for me, that was an extraordinary, in some ways, humbling lesson that Judaism, although it's got an ism, isn't really an ism. It's not a universal religion. It's an ethno-religion, strictly speaking. And more beautifully, it is simply a family of 15 to 16 million people at the moment. And it includes what Rabbi Ingber would call spiritual technology. And so the role of inheritance and the reason for all of these lineages, this person, son of this person, son of this person, and the amazing Sarah, the one woman who gets to be mentioned amongst all these men. I love it. Sarah with an E. I saw that name and I was like, "Oh, if I ever have a daughter, that's a powerful name." So this idea of family and this idea of inheritance. So all of this was shocking to me when I first came to this text, and thrilling and confusing and disorienting, and the great blessing of this text to me is the first Torah portion that I ever studied in Hebruta is all the things that I listed, right? A little bit of the story of Moses, like, which is in some ways the story of all stories. Crushingly disappointed, like Moses, you're going to die and you're not going to get to the promised land. So in some ways, the hardest part of that entire story. These little unfulfilled trivialities and threads, like Pinhas and Sarah and the daughters of Zelophehad, and these massive lists of genealogies, these super pedantic instructions, this call to warfare, which is, amazing and difficult, this wrath, this justice, all of it. For me, that's the entire Torah in one parsha, or at least the entire Tanakh. This range of the brutal and the beautiful, the just and the seemingly unjust, the violent and the benevolent, the trivial and the powerful, just all in one. Like, this is the beach in a grain of sand. So whatever coincidence, we just picked it up because it was this time of year. And then I went to like my first Rosh Hashanah and my first Yom Kippur and a whole bunch of firsts. But this was one of my firsts. So I just wanted to share with you that unfamiliarity, that shock of the new, and that defamiliarization and making of the familiar strange. That was my gift amongst the pine needles. So I think that's pretty much everything that happens in this parsha. Did I cover it, Ashrafan? Okay. So we're going to hand it over to our rabbi online, who like the Wizard of Oz, is going to take us into some closer listenings and readings around, especially secession. And I'm going to add my 2 cents on one of these. And between the two of us, we're going to somehow bring all of our fellow Joshua's and co-teachers into the conversation in a way that will inevitably be rushed, awkward, and frustrating in the usual way every Saturday morning. All right, so Asher Chaim, can I hand the Olympic torch to you?
Thank you. Thank you. It was a beautiful introduction because I always smile when Rabbi Kolresis begins with, "This is one of my favorite Torah portions." It's someone who has 54 children, and each one is the favorite child as it sits on your lap. But you have really helped us see this as a small piece of a puzzle that connects to all the other pieces. Thank you. There will be some reflection in my glasses because I've got these texts on my screen at the same time. I didn't print things up.
Asher Chaim, would you like me to share the source sheet? I could screen share it if you would like.
In a moment, yes, thank you.
Of course.
Or maybe we could make Asher Chaim's head big so we can see him in the room. Can we do that? Can we
Yeah,
puff him up?
I can
There he
be
is.
I can be spotlighted from time to time, even if it makes everyone else smaller. Okay,
Got it.
first on a serious note, this week's Torah study is particularly devoted to the healing of Eliezer ben Esther, husband of our master teacher, Rabbi Diane Kohler-Esses, as Larry recovers from injuries. May he be healed among all in our community and beyond our community who are in need of healing. As we say in the Shirah prayer, Shabbat himilizok urefuah krova lavo. Shabbat himilizok, it is Shabbat, so we usually refrain from asking for our needs. Urefuah krova lavo, yet we remain confident that healing will come soon. I've titled this week's study sheet, and I'm not used to making these things, "The Anxieties of Succession." It's something that has been on the minds of most, if not all, Americans in recent weeks, and I will try to resist the temptation to talk about politics in America, as that is an area where there is, within the Jewish community and beyond, legitimate disagreement. And there must be room in our community for all of the different voices coming from all of the different angles. Whatever sign people have on their lawn, when people come to study together and to pray together, we are united. So, the anxiety of succession is also something that comes up when we first realize that we will not live forever. And here is a good point to bring up and share the study sheet, the source sheet. Caroline, if you could do that Deus Ex Machina. Thank you. How wrong we were to think immortality meant never dying. That's from songwriter Gerard Way, and I thank Tomas for finding that quote.
Yeah.
There's a
The
piece of
quote-
wisdom. I'm sorry?
No, I was just going to say that the quote that it complements, Gerard Way is just a artsy hipster singer songwriter from Canada, but he has this especially beautiful song, of which this is the lyric. But the quote that it complements, and the way that I got to that quote, was one that I think I've mentioned in this room before, from the teacher Joseph Campbell, the Jungian psychologist, the author of The Hero with 1,000 Faces, talks about the hero's journey and the kind of monomyth and how, especially the Tanakh is part of that human inheritance of story. And Joseph Campbell simply says, eternity is not later. It's outside of time, which means it's not earlier, it's not later, it's not before, it's not after. Possibly it's now, but it's the same spirit, which is how we got to this quote. But this is about mortality and our knowledge and denial of death. Back to you, Ashrafan.
The second quote, I was certain that it was somewhere in rabbinic literature, but maybe not. Plant a tree, raise a child, write a book. These are 3 suggestions for living beyond our lifetime, leaving behind a more fruitful world if the tree survives, leaving behind an equally mortal potential disciple to carry the ball forward if he or she remains true to the same vision, and leaving behind timeless words for as long as anyone can or will read them. So I hate to sound like Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, but yeah, there is a certain futility to it all as far as how great an impact we can have on how long a future. But these are ways in which we try to stretch beyond our own mortality. So here is Moshe, a youngster at 120, whose big brother lived to 123 and whose big sister died at a later age, though it's not mentioned explicitly. And here he is, imagining that he will indeed lead his people across the river into the promised land and perhaps live happily ever after. From the neck up, he may understand that he will not live forever. But, you know, the intellect is highly overrated. 95% of who we are is from the neck down. And from the neck down, Moshe has a vision. So, who is the most likely candidate in waiting? Who is most likely to succeed Moshe and succeed in carrying forth his vision through the conquest and beyond? Fair question? Let's start with looking back to last week's exciting episode, in which 2 giants indeed died. For Miriam, there was no successor. And for Aaron, there was an obvious successor. This week, the question is, who will try or succeed in succeeding Moshe? The portion opens with a likely candidate. And we'll start with that text, which is number 5, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, the opening verse of this week's Torah portion. Yud Hey Vav Hey's called to Moshe, saying, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen, Heishiv et Hamati me'al b'nei Yisrael. Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aharon, the Kohen, turned back my anger from against the Israelites. B'kan'oet pin'ati b'tocham, by acting passionately on behalf of my passion in the midst of the Israelites. V'lo chiliti et b'nei Yisrael b'kin'ati, so that I did not wipe out the Israelites in my passion. From the Matan podcast, there's an interesting I forget the literary term for it, opening and closing of parentheses, that,
Caesura.
thank you, the first time we encounter the tribe of Levi, it is the Levites who avenge the violation of their sister by massacring a city, Shechem. And here, at a time that Israel and Midian are in life and death struggle over idolatry, expressed through sacred immorality, if you want to put it that way, Pinchas kills 2 people and avoids the slaughter of countless others. And interestingly, Shimon and Levi had worked together at the time of the violation of Dinah, and here it is a Levite descendant killing a Simeonite descendant. But that's a different rabbit hole. It managed to turn away God's wrath by killing 1 couple. Lachein emor, therefore say, verse 12, Hineni noten lo et briti shalom. Behold, I give him my covenant of shalom, peace, wholeness. And yes, in certain manuscript traditions, the vav of the letter shalom is a broken vav, which commentators say shows that the shalom that comes through an act of violence is not complete. Verse 13, V'haita lo ulzaro aharav brit kihunat olam. There will be for him and his offspring after him a covenant of priesthood forever. Tahat asher kinei lelohav vaychaper al bnei Israel, because he took passionate action on behalf of his God and achieved atonement for the Israelites.
Pastor Chaim, I might just add, about these verses 12 and 13. Like, this is what I do remember from my very first hour of Torah study in Havruta, speaking to my expectation that this figure, Pinchas, would actually be punished for this act of violence against Romeo and Juliet, against the forbidden lovers in the previous chapter, and that would be the nature of the justice, and to see that it was otherwise, that in a sense, a different type of passion, his zeal, his righteousness, his agency was, in a sense, rewarded by this investiture of priesthood. But I remember we did touch on this exact question, because I guess in my slightly Jesus-y way, I wanted it to be a punishment, right? So,
Okay,
so
but
with my Havruta, I was like, well, is it a punishment to have this task for all time? To be tangled up in the priesthood, to have this gig, and in some ways to know the future of all of your descendants, to have their future foreclosed in that way. So even though it's
I must push back. It was
Please
not
push
Romeo.
back.
It was not Romeo and Juliet.
I know, I'm just reporting
It was
my
not Romeo and Juliet.
I know.
It was an act of cult prostitution being carried out at Ohel Moed.
I stand in so many ways and so often corrected, Asher Chaim. I merely report my first impressions and the enduring character of these people in my heart, if not in the 5% above my neck.
The rabbis also made sure that you don't try this at home. They say Pinchas took radical action that was approved ex post facto, but Moshe had not told him to do it. And if he had asked Moshe or a court, the court would have told him not to do it, that you don't kill people without due process. So the rabbis also want to tame Pinchas, but dare I say, the text, God wants to tame Pinchas. The similarity of Pinchas and Moshe, remember Moshe's first official act leaving the palace was to see injustice and slay the Egyptian taskmaster. Take decisive action. So Pinchas is cut from the same cloth as Moshe. I'm going to circle back to that much later, if we can get through all of the texts. But for now, notice God is saying, your job for the rest of your life is not to be the enforcer and killer. You're not to be the general full-time. Your full-time day job is slaughtering animals. You're not afraid of blood? Great. Dash blood on the altar. Use that skill within the Mishkan in a very circumscribed way for you and your children forever. Let someone else be the full-time general. Yes, Pinchas will be called, I believe twice more in his long life, to lead an army in holy battle. But that's it. The gig of Kohanim is to tame their Levitical passion and work within a very narrow structure where the number of lambs and bullocks and all of that is going to be counted and limited in the flyover territory of the end of this week's Torah portion. All of the sacrifices that may have been mind-numbing for you could be seen as a sublimation of that desire for blood. Okay, let me move off that. I'm sorry it's triggering. But here is the candidate, Pinchas. And yet, what comes up next is totally unexpected. Verse 6. Caroline, I hope you're scrolling to the 6th text. The daughters of Tzelofchad come forward. And they...
Can I make one comment?
I'm sorry, what?
Just make a comment in the room.
Okay. I wanted to just note that Hashem gave the blessing of the kahuna to Aaron and to Pinchas, but not to Pinchas's father, Eleazar. He never gave the blessing of the kahuna to his father, only to Aaron, his grandfather, and him.
Well, yes, but Eleazar will be central as the Kohen in later verses. So it doesn't really skip a generation.
Just Aaron and his father allowed to not.
But I'd like to go ahead because Tzelofchad's daughters come forward. And instead of confronting Moshe and his authority, Vatikravna, they drew close. And they said, our father died, leaving no sons. Inheritance seems to be from father to son. Why will our father's portion in the land of Israel be lost? That's not fair. And Moshe doesn't have an answer. He's not used to this kind of question. We'll circle back to that later. He inquires of God, and in verse 6, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, God to Moshe, Cain benot Tzlofchad dovrot. The daughters of Tzlofchad speak truth. Cain, yes, affirmation. That's the first word in the sentence. Naton titein lahem achuzat nahala betoch achei avihem. You shall surely give them an inheritance portion amongst the brothers of their father. Ta'avartat nahalat avihen lahen. You shall carry over the inheritance of their father to them. Okay. Rashi will underline a couple of words there. But right after that, in verse 12, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Ale el har ha'avarim hazeh. God to Moshe, go up on this Mount Avarim, ure'eh ha'aretz asher natati livnei Yisrael, and view the land that I have given to the Israelites. Vera'ita otah ונאספת אל עמך, גם אתה, כאשר נאסף אהרון אחיך. You will see it and be gathered to your people also you, just as your brother Aharon was gathered to his people. כאשר מריתם בי במדבר צין במריבת העדה להקדישני במים לעיניהם. As you had pushed back against my mouth in the wilderness of Tzin, in the struggling of the community for sanctifying me by water in their eyes. Merivat Kadesh Midbar Tzin. Those are the waters of Merivah, of strife in the wilderness of Tzin. You remember the episode from last week's Torah portion of Moshe striking the rock. So Rashi's commentary, could we have someone in the Zoom room read number 8? Beth, are you up for some reading?
Sure, I can read. I'm not.
Text 8 in the English?
Yeah, I can do that. So Rashi's talking about Numbers 27:12. Go up unto this Mount Arabim. Why does this follow immediately here? Because when the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, thou shalt surely give them an inheritance in the land, he, Moshe, said, it is me that the Omnipresent has commanded to apportion the inheritance. Perhaps then the decree that I must die in the wilderness is annulled, and I shall enter the promised land. Whereupon God said to him, my decree remains exactly as it was. Midrash Tahuma, Pinchas 9.
So the Midrash notices the event of the daughters of Tzlofchad, followed immediately by God saying, nope, you're not going to live to see the land. And Rashi connects the dots. And there is mention again of the incident at Masa Merivah. So let's go back, text number 9, and look at that story again.
Asher Chaim, can you clarify how those dots are connected by Rashi? It's not clear to me anymore.
The daughters of Tzlochad will be granted an inheritance.
Right.
And God says, you shall surely give them an inheritance. And Moshe says, I got a reprieve. I'm going to cross the river. I'm going to apportion the land. I'm going to make sure that the daughters of Tzlofchad get their inheritance.
Ah. So the dream of a fulfillment after a denial, Moses says it's going to happen to me.
Yeah, because often God has been persuaded to back from a harsh decree. And here Moshe reads between God's words that he will get to do this.
Right.
I see a raised hand from Yair in Toronto.
I think what's interesting also implicit is the fact that you can lose an inheritance. Because, well, clearly the reason given for Moshe not being able to fulfill the inheritance of leading people into the land is an act that Moshe undertook in defiance of God. So implicit here, it's something I've never really seen discussed much, is an inheritance. Well, we have all those fights between the firstborn and the secondborn throughout, especially Breshit, but there it's taken away mostly. Here, it's an idea which I find interesting, which is one, through one's actions, can actually lose or forfeit an inheritance.
Since we heard from Toronto, anyone want to hold it down from New York?
Question.
So
speaking of zeal, so Jehu, from the book of Jehu,
Right.
has similar strong zeal, although his heart at the end quite. Yeah. Why is he, somehow not as regarded or standing up for Hashem as a Pinchas? His zeal is quite. He started pretty strong, right? Pretty strong zeal, but then it didn't end so well.
What was the action he took in
So
expression
his
of that zeal?
Jezebel and just standing up to that kingdom in the north, right? And he was quite Jehu here in his zeal, and it just I love Jehu in the beginning, just his strong stand for Hashem. But just the way the northern kingdom how he took over,
Yes.
and I could see the parallel in the zeal that Pinchas took, not Jehu, but yet they both are regarded differently.
I love the parallel, and in terms of how it's regarded differently,
Yeah.
this is just one learner's opinion before I hand it back to Asher Chaim, is using one of Rabbi David's favorite words, which is skill and skillful. And what's beautiful about that word is in some ways it's morally neutral. Skillful and unskillful is different from good and bad, right? Good and evil, villain and hero. And in my own experience, especially as a teacher, there's a distinction between skill and talent. Like talent is a little bit nature, like it's whatever temperament or spirit happens to be in you. And there is this word spirit in reference to Pinchas, that he's this spirited person. That spirit and that zealousness applies, and I think also to this other individual. They are zealous.
Yeah.
They have that talent. They have a talent for zeal. There's a beautiful biography, by the way, of the historical Jesus, which is just called Zealot, because that's how he was described in the one extra biblical text about that historical figure. He was a zealot, another one of these zealous people. But that's the talent for zeal. But the skill comes from experience. It's like, okay, let me learn how to apply this talent and to add to that talent some quality of discernment. Another one of Rabbi Ingber's words, and that talent is tempered by experience and becomes skill.
Yeah, because Jehu, Elijah was commanded to put his hand on him, put his spirit, right? So he had the command from Hashem to bless and basically anoint Jehu. So meaning he had the spirit of Hashem, is that he turned it into really bad ending.
Well, let's turn it back to Asher Chaim for another transfer of spirit and anointment, which comes with Joshua, which I know we're getting to, and maybe that can shine some light.
First, I'm sorry that I was not hearing clearly the remarks from the room. Is that Alex who just spoke? Thank you. You're referring to the king, Jehu,
Yeah.
but also to the prophet Elijah. And in the rabbinic imagination, Elijah is hyper-identified with Pinchas to the point where the commentator Ibn Ezra has to say, no, Pinchas did not live forever and become Elijah.
Wow.
They had the same spirit, but they were different people. But Elijah, like Pinchas, there is ambivalence about his acts of violence. When he has the showdown on Mount Carmel and everybody suddenly believes in God, that lasts about 48 hours and then he's on the run. So sometimes the exercise of righteous indignation ends brilliantly for about 48 hours, but does not end up working brilliantly in the longer run. But I'd like to go back to hitting the rock, last week's exciting episode. Text number 9. You may recall, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moshe when the people were thirsting for water after the death of Miriam. Pah et hamakkeh, pick up your stick. Remember that staff that was used to inflict 10 plagues on Egypt? Take your rod, v'haqhel et ha'edah, and gather the people, Atav Yaharon Achicha, you and your brother Aaron, v'dibartem el hasela, and speak to the rock, le'enehem, in their eyesight. V'natan meimav, and it shall give its waters. V'hoseita lahem mayim min hasela, shall bring forth on their behalf water from the rock, V'hishtita et ha'edah v'et be'iram, and provide drink for the congregation and their beasts. Okay.
A friendly reminder to people in the Zoom to mute.
I think it's Dr. Rosen. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
We love to spy on
I'm
you,
used to the
but
word,
you don't want to.
a word that I came across many times is neuroplasticity.
Mhm.
Would someone like to read the description from the NIH in number 10? Maybe someone in the room?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, neural plasticity, also known as neural plasticity or brain plasticity, is a process that involves adaptive structural and functional changes to the brain. It is defined as the ability of the nervous system to change its activity in response to intrinsic or extrinsic stimuli by reorganizing its structure, functions, or connections after injuries such as stroke or traumatic brain injury, TBI. This activity describes neuroplasticity, evaluation and management, neuroplasticity, and reviews the role of the interprofessional team in improving care for patients.
So there's something about how the brain rewires itself after an injury. And people who have, lo alenu, suffered from a stroke and cannot move certain muscles, somehow the brain rewires and uses different connections so that if A is not working, there might be a different pathway to solving the problem without using those same synapses. I've just dropped in the chat, my mom was a pioneer in applying methods of neuroplasticity to stroke many years ago, forming new connections. So the brain is able to figure out a different way to solve a problem. And I would like to use that as a metaphor. Can we overcome our instinctive reactions if those instinctive reactions yield negative results? Again, the first time we met Moshe, he saw injustice and he fixed it by killing an Egyptian taskmaster. But the next day, when two Israelites were fighting and Moshe sought to intervene, one said, "Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian?" And Moshe realized that the matter was known and had negative side effects that he should have perhaps foreseen had he been thinking more slowly instead of more quickly. That's why he had to flee. Now, Moshe's ability to balance using his staff to bring plagues on Pharaoh, but also negotiating with Pharaoh to remove those plagues, is a balancing act. There's that famous quote from Abraham Maslow that if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And here, God tested Moshe at Memeriva and said, Moshe, pick up your hammer, look at this nail, and speak to it. Do you have that capability at this age and stage in your life? Maybe he was only 119 back then, a mere impetuous youth. Do you have that skill set, not only to strike the rock as you did back in Exodus, but to speak to the rock as I now require of you? And at that critical moment, Moshe reverted to striking the rock. So now,
Asher Chaim, can I amplify something you said about neuroplasticity?
please.
That, obviously this is about having the courage and the curiosity to go against the grain of our habituated behaviors, right? And
Say
to-
that again slowly.
So the courage and the curiosity to go against the grain of our habituated behaviors and to find out what would happen if we did it differently. And this is, something I fail at every single day. And it goes to this idea of repetition, which we see in these great lines of succession in the Parsha and in these great descriptions of ritual in the Parsha. But the possibility of repetition with variation. We're going to do it the same but different. And the reason it gets my attention, traumatic brain injury, right? Trauma, the word is right there. That's a word that often comes up around this table with good reason, as both something in our lives and another strange inheritance, particularly in this family of Judeans. And I spent a long time with the head of neuroscience at Harvard Medical School because she was taking care of my dad. And because my dad was always late to appointments, I would just have a seminar with the head of neuroscience at Harvard University Med School and quiz her about things. And she was kind of a poet for a scientist. And she said that one of the things about neuroplasticity in her research was that for her, it had almost a metaphorical or a strange spiritual significance, because for her, it offered a model of recovery in the absence of healing. Because she said there are some injuries from which we do not heal, even in our optimistic society in which everyone is always getting better and anything can be fixed, right? There's this very sober thing, especially in medicine, that some things do not heal. And so when you have a stroke and part of your brain actually physically, it functionally is no longer alive, that part of your brain does not heal. There is no healing.
Why is that? Cells regenerate.
That's right.
Yeah.
But in the absence of healing, and whatever we mean by that word, literally or figuratively, there is still recovery. And recovery in this very strict definition of recovery of function. Because the brain is such a miraculously complex system, I can do with this part of the brain over here eventually what I used to do with this part over here. And that's adaptive transformation. So this concept of recovery in the absence of healing has always meant a lot to me. And so I just want to offer it within that context. Beck, there's a thought in the room?
I'd like to argue the opposite. I see in the world today and also throughout history that inaction has caused tremendous problems. That by not attacking something right at the beginning caused world wars. When you see peaceful protesters, anti-Semitic peaceful protesters, and you don't react in a long way, you have huge problems. So it's how that line, when is it time to act and when is it time to talk? That determines the future.
Do you think this is
Rob,
why
to
it's
quote
important?
the great prophet, you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them.
I'd say
Know
that
when
there.
to walk away, know when to run. But I
Look
think it's
before
important,
you-
given your comments, you
Look
start the
before
parsha
you
with
leap,
action, with
and
Pinchas.
Taking action.
Look before you leap, and he who hesitates is lost. And they're both true.
Ready, fire, aim. But the parsha does begin with zeal and immediacy of action, and with recognition and reward for that spirit and temperament and talent for zeal. So I think that actually supports your interpretation.
And as we see it play out, there will also be a critique of that approach.
Take us to it, Asher Chaim.
Yeah.
So in verse 11, once Moshe understands that his sentence was not commuted, he will not go into the land. In a moment of extreme love and altruism, love for his people that is more important than his own future and his own ego. Reading number 11. Vaidaber Moshe el Adonai lemor. Moshe spoke to God, saying, this is one of the, I think there are only two occasions of Vaidaber Moshe el Hashem lemor. And I don't remember the other off my top of my head, sorry. Yifkod Adonai Elohei haruchot lechol basar ish al ha'edah. Let Yud He Vav He, God of all, Spirit of all flesh, appoint someone over the community, Asher Yeseh Lifnehem v'Asher Yavo Lifnehem, who will go out before them and come back before them, v'Asher Yosieim v'Asher Yivieim, who will lead them out and will lead them back. V'lo tihyeh adat Adonai kason asher ein lahem ro'eh, so that the community of Yud He Vav He will not be like sheep without a shepherd. I have to take a breath. Because Moshe circles back to that other period in his life where he was not the enforcer, not the man with the hammer, but the man who used his staff to keep the flock of his father-in-law safe, to gather them together, keep them all on the same page, as it were, keep them properly guided. He doesn't say like a shepherd who uses his staff to whack any predator that tries to come near, but a leader. And here there is a hint that Moshe is open to the possibility that the leader will be a leader very unlike him in his later career. And that is also one more reason to love and respect him and mourn his loss. That he's not looking for a clone, a mini me. He's looking for his people to have the proper shepherd. So in the search for a successor, Pinchas knows how to bang a nail with a hammer, but that may not be enough of a skill set. We may need someone who will stop and be deliberative before acting. Now, in the biblical narrative, there are only a couple of stories about Joshua as Moshe's sidekick, apprentice, whatever. When Moshe is up on the mountain and the golden calf episode is happening, and Moshe comes back down the mountain, Joshua is there to report to him, but Joshua does not take action without Moshe's approval. And later, when there are elders appointed to help Moshe handle a crisis, And after the crisis, there are still a couple of loose cannons prophesying in the camp. I thought I had included this text, but I guess I didn't. Oh yes, here it is. Look at reading number 12. Vayaros Hanar, the lad ran, Vayaged Moshe, Vayomar, and he reported to Moshe and said, Eldad u'Medad mitnabe'im b'mahaneh. Eldad and Medad are acting prophet in the midst of the camp. Vayan Yoshua ben Nun misharet Moshe mibahurav. Vayomer Adoni Moshe kilaim. Joshua, son of Nun, Moshe's gopher from among his young men, said, My Lord Moses, lock them up. Vayomer lo Moshe. Moshe responded to him, Hamnaqamne ata li. Are you going to be zealous on my behalf? Umiyatain kol am Adonai nevi'im, ki yatain Adonai et rucho alehem. If only all of God's nation were prophets, that Yud-Heh Vav-Heh would put divine spirit on them. So notice, Joshua was about to act as a Kanai, a zealot. Moshe says, no, dude, restraint. These guys are not a threat. They're evidence of success. So don't take precipitous action. Don't lock them up. When you ask me, you'll discover there's a very different truth, a very different approach. And this is coming from Moshe, who often treats a problem as a nail and takes out his hammer.
Yeah, this is Moshe really modeling that resistance to habituated behavior, right? He's not really doing what we might expect him to do, which is to smite someone.
Because he's not feeling threatened.
Right.
There's a brilliant essay by the late Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs about the difference between power and influence. If one person has 10 shares of power and finds someone else with whom to share that power, the original person is down to 5 shares of power. But if a teacher has 10 students, every share of influence is multiplied by the number of people who share that influence. And here Moshe is saying, if only my influence were multiplied by everyone being a prophet. So perhaps now it will not be a surprise whom God chooses for the succession. Reading 13, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Hach lecha et Yehoshua ben Nun ish asher ruach bo, v'samachta et yadav alav. Choose Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom there is spirit, and lay your hands on him. I'm sorry, just one moment while I switch screens, because I think I made a later modification. No, okay. והעמדת אותו לפני אלעזר הכהן ולפני כל העדה, וציווית אותו לעיניהם. Stand him up in front of Elazar the Kohen. Notice, it is Elazar acting in loco parentis, in the place of his father no longer alive. Vilifnei kol ha'edah, and in front of all of the nation, and command him before their eyes. V'natata mehodecha alav, invest him with your hod, your honor and authority. L'ma'an yishme'u kol adat b'nei Israel, so that all of the Israelites will listen. Again, Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory, there is no biblical Hebrew word for obey, but the word Shema has resonances of listening and acting. V'lifnei Elazar HaKohen Ya'amod, he will stand in the presence of Elazar the Kohen. V'sha'al lo b'mishpat ha'urim lifnei Adonai al piv yetz'u v'al piv yavo'u hu v'chol b'nei Yisrael ito v'chol ha'ida. And in the presence of Elazar HaKohen he will stand so that he may inquire of him for matters of judgment, inquire the Urim v'Tumim, the oracular breastplate in the presence of God. By his mouth they will go out, and by his mouth they will come back, he and all of the Israelites with him and all of the nation. Fascinating footnote for you that, and I forget the source, but I can try to look it up. Joshua is being told that when he needs to ask a question of God, he can go to Elazar and get an answer through the Urim v'Tumim. When we read the book of Joshua, God will speak to Joshua many, many times. And how many times will Joshua ask Elazar for an answer from God through the Urim v'Tumim? Not.
I know the answer because Asher Chaim told me it's 0.
Never at all. So if Joshua is feeling insecure, how will I know what God wants? In case of emergency, break glass, pull lever. Elazar is there. Vayas Moshe ka'asher tziva Adonai oto. Moshe did as God had commanded him. Vayitach et Yehoshua. He took Yehoshua. Vayamidehu lifnei Elazar HaKohen v'lifnei kol ha'ida. He stood him up in front of Elazar the Kohen and in front of all of the nation. Vayismoch et yadav alav, and he pressed down his hands upon him. Vayisavehu, and he commanded him, bequeathed him. Siva is both. It's when you give over a legacy, that is also siva. Ka'asher diber Adonai biyad Moshe, as God had spoken in the hands of Moshe. So here is a very different kind of leader who will not be a prophet like Moshe and may have a slightly different temperament than Moshe. And Moshe may be legitimately fearful that his successor may not have the same impulses and instincts as they go into the land of promise. And I will avoid the temptation to go down the rabbit hole of Moshe asking whether Joshua has proper Zionist credentials to lead the people, and instead race to the spoiler. I stumbled across an article in the Jewish Biblical Quarterly written by Rabbi Chaim Angel of the She'ereth Israel congregation, who wrote Moonlit Leadership and Midrashic Reading of Joshua's Success. If Moshe was like the sun, according to Midrash, if Moshe was like the sun, Joshua was like the moon. A less brilliant, less overwhelming source of light that was a reflection, perhaps, of his mentor. So it's a long article worth finding and reading, but I pulled out 2 excerpts, and perhaps we could have a reader in the Zoom room for the first and a reader in Manhattan for the second. Selection 14. It will require a little strolling in the middle, Caroline. Do we have a reader?
I see Jay's raising Jay and Brenda are raising their hands.
No, I had a question.
Jay's is for a question, so Brenda, if you'd please read. But you have to unmute.
Despite the fears that nation and reader may have experienced concerning Joshua's abilities to lead, he became one of Israel's most effective leaders. The only recorded sin of his period was that Achan, more impressively, a nation that persistently complained throughout Moses' 40 years of leadership, grumbled only once in the book of Joshua to the elders and not to Joshua after they mistakenly struck a treaty with the Gibeonites, most remarkably, even after their hearts.
Keep going.
After their hearts sank in total dismay following their defeat of, how do you say that? AI?
I.
They
We
did
do
not
need to defeat AI.
They did not complain to Joshua. Paradoxically, it may be that the people had more confidence in Joshua than in Moses, precisely because Joshua himself was terrified after the loss at Ai.
The backstory is that after the successful conquest of Jericho, they march on towards Ai, and they are initially pushed back and defeated. And Joshua complains to God, "Why did you have us cross the Jordan River? We're being massacred here." And God answers, it's because there was supposed to be 0 spoils taken from the destruction of Jericho. And somebody did take spoils, and that's why this happened. And Joshua leads the people, and they continue with the process of the conquest of Canaan. So what Angel is pointing out is that the dog that didn't bark, this people who constantly complained against Moses, did not rebel against Joshua or against God during the time of Joshua's leadership. And the next paragraph to be read by someone in Manhattan.
Who's feeling it?
But face the microphone when you read so that we'll hear you.
You already read. I got a call on somebody else. Would you like to read?
Sure. Moses is unparalleled?
Yeah.
Moses' unparalleled awe of God was so great that he simply could not fathom why his people did not trust God also. Ironically, then, Moses' incomparable faith may have been precisely at the root of his struggles in leading the Israelites. In contrast, the people never rebelled against Joshua because they detected his fears and therefore viewed him as one of them. Thus, Joshua was able to bridge the world of Moses with their world. Empathy.
I know that part of the purpose of this class on Saturday mornings is to leave us with this desperate tip of the tongue feeling of like, oh, I wanted to say this, I wanted to ask this. Or often for me, the perfect thought only comes when I'm like back out on the sidewalk, of course.